Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Delta Blues, the life and times of the Mississippi masters who revolutionized American music, by Ted Gioia. Narrated by Chris Abernathy. Preface. At the age of 20, I naively believed I had a deep understanding of the blues. Schooled as a modern jazz pianist, I had studied the chord patterns and substitute harmonies, the rhythmic devices, the standard melodic licks, and the more convoluted bebop or modal reconfigurations of blues music. I could play the blues in every key and in various time signatures. I even composed my own blues, drawing on the trendiest musical notions of the day. Yet my knowledge, as I see now in retrospect, began and ended with the structure of the blues. Of its meaning and inner vitality, I understood very little at the time. In a very real sense, I was ignorant of the most essential aspects of the music I was attempting to assimilate and perform. Only gradually did I come to appreciate the deeper essence of the blues. The process took place so slowly that I was often only dimly aware of how my perspectives and preconceptions were being transformed. But in time, I found myself listening to the same blues music I had heard in my youth with much different ears, and certainly no longer in the glib assurance that I had plumbed its depths. On the contrary, the music now seemed multi-layered, otherworldly, elusive. I sensed a richness to these songs, especially the older blues from the Delta tradition, that I had missed before. Of course, the music itself had not changed during the intervening years, but I had altered considerably. Partly, this newfound appreciation stemmed from, I would like to think, a growing maturity on my part. But equally, my attraction to traditional blues was no doubt fueled by my growing dissatisfaction with the overpowering commercialization and commoditization I encountered elsewhere in the music world. Traditional blues' stubborn allegiance to its own guiding lights, its resistance to corporate interference, its blissful ignorance of music videos and trendy radio formats, its affirmation of its own inexpressibly rich heritage, these all sharpened my sense of its value. My research into traditional styles of music during much of the 1990s further stirred my interest and appreciation of early African American performances styles. At first, this research was conducted from afar, but my move to Texas 5 years ago, after a lifetime spent mostly in California or overseas, gave me an exciting opportunity to study traditional music in the locales where it had once flourished. Here I settled in a neighborhood where Skip James had spent much of the 1930s, and a few miles away from the site of Robert Johnson's final recording session, but also within walking distance of the old Chisholm Trail. After decades of passionate, almost obsessive interest in modern jazz, I now found many of my most satisfying moments of musical discovery coming from a much different body of work. I researched and wrote on cowboy music, work songs, Native American traditions, and other neglected facets of our nation's oral history. But above all, the early blues captured my imagination, and as I began undertaking research trips into the Mississippi Delta region, I felt myself confronted by what I now felt was perhaps the most influential musical tradition America had produced, yet one still poorly understood and insufficiently appreciated. All my assumptions about music now seemed under attack and constant revision. After several decades of playing the piano, I began learning the traditional instruments of the Delta. I returned to the harmonica, an instrument I had played with enthusiasm in my teens. On a Delta trip, I acquired a diddley bow, the one-string instrument that had been the starting point for many blues guitarists, and began learning how to play it with a knife. Quite a change and challenge after years of having the 88 notes of the piano keyboard at my disposal. I next returned to the guitar, an instrument I had hardly picked up since I was 16 years old, and taught myself how to read tablature notation. I studied the transcriptions of Delta blues guitar recordings and also began developing blues figures and patterns of my own, inspired by the music of the masters of the idiom. To some extent, I felt like a child again, discovering music for the first time. In this book, I've tried to take an expansive view of the Delta tradition, not only focusing on the musicians native to the region, but also pausing to explore the careers of those who lived in close vicinity to the Delta, and thus absorbed its influences, or who resided in the Delta for shorter or longer periods and brought the experiences of these years to other parts of the world. This is a rich and complex story, as the careers of Muddy Waters, Howlin Wolf, John Lee Hooker, and B.B. King make clear. The sounds of the Delta have traveled far over the decades, impacting other styles of music and changing the sonic landscape of our times. These far-reaching reverberations are, I believe, a proper part of my account of the Delta blues. But I also wanted to take time to focus on the almost forgotten figures, large, if little-known talents such as G.C. Wiley or Kid Bailey or Mattie Mae Thomas and others, who might have developed into well-known stars, but whose brilliance is obscured because they recorded so little and their biographies are so sketchy. My hope is that a far-reaching study of this sort will inspire blues lovers to open up their ears to riches from the Delta heritage that they may have previously missed or ignored. And as always has been the case for me, researching and writing gave me a grand excuse to knock on doors, meet people, and initiate conversations. The resulting dialogues are often referred to here, but this book gives only the barest indication of the full scope of these encounters. My debts in this regard are many, especially since my studies were not solitary ones, but enriched by daily exchanges with many people. Chapter 1. The Blues and the Old Kingdoms. 1. From Catfish Row to Graceland. The Delta region of Mississippi is an expansive alluvial plain, shaped like the leaf of a pecan tree hanging lazily over the rest of the state. Stretching some 220 miles from Vicksburg to Memphis, it is bounded on the west by the Mississippi River and extends eastward for an average of 65 miles, terminating in hill country with its poorer soil and different ways of life, and the Yazoo River, which eventually joins the Mississippi at Vicksburg. For blues fans, this is the Delta, although geologists will remind us that it is not the proper delta of the Mississippi River, which is found where the mighty currents flow into the Gulf of Mexico south of New Orleans. No U.S. president has hailed from the Delta region, or indeed from anywhere in Mississippi, nor has a vice president. No Chief Justice of the Supreme Court was born here, no Secretary of State. The region's contributions to the fields of chemistry and physics are practically nil. The same can be said for economics, psychology, sociology, and a college course catalog full of other academic disciplines. None of the Dow Jones Industrial Companies have their headquarters here. In fact, not a single member of the Fortune 500 calls Mississippi its home. Yet, music the world over was transformed by the songs made here. The influence of the Delta on the sound of our musical lives is so pervasive today that it is almost impossible to take full measure of its impact. One might as well try to imagine cooking without herbs and spices, or medicine before the arrival of penicillin. Our soundscapes were revitalized by the blues tonality, which found rich deposits by mining the cracks between the notes of our Western scales. New modes of musical expression were made possible by the blues way of phrasing, the crisp bite of its distinctive harmonies, and its penetrating melodies. Without the blues, much of the music we hear every day would be fundamentally different, eviscerated, and tepid. And without the Delta, we can hardly imagine the blues exerting such a powerful influence. During the 1920s and 1930s, when the first great recordings of the Delta blues were made, the level of poverty among the people who created this music was staggering. Mississippi had the lowest per capita income of any state, less than half of the average for the country as a whole. It ranked dead last in per capita retail sales, last in the percentage of its residents who owned telephones and radios, last in the proportion who registered motor vehicles, last in the percentage whose homes were wired for electricity. Indeed, for the Delta residents, electricity might as well have not existed. As late as 1937, fewer than 1% of the farms had use of it. Here it seemed as if a third-world country had been abandoned in the heart of the United States, left to fend for itself with its simple rural staples of cotton and catfish, in the midst of a booming modern economy whose benefits it did not share. But the poverty of the people stood in stark contrast to the richness of the soil, declared by an expert at the dawn of the 20th century to be the most fertile to be found anywhere on the globe. Even so, cultivation of this land did not come easily. Thick forests of cypress and gum, oak and ash planted their roots here, and were home to deer and wolf, bear and panther. What little space remained was crowded with impenetrable vines and dense canebrakes, which sometimes stood taller than a man on horseback. During the Civil War, Grant twice failed in his attempts to mount an attack on Vicksburg from the north by way of the Delta region, and he finally gave up in despair at bringing his troops through such an impassable combination of swamp and cane, trees and wild animals. Yet visitors today see wide-open land, and a terrain so flat that the bumps on Highway 61 are often the highest elevation in sight, and the center line of the road stretches on for miles without deviating more than a few inches to left or right. The deforestation started by the loggers was continued by the planters, until only the mounds left behind by the region's first settlers, the Choctaw, puzzling protuberances sometimes containing graves or artifacts, at other times empty of any remains or objects, resisted the leveling impulse. But even these last elevations in the landscape have been forced to give way, removed one after another until only a few still stand. Like the trees and cane, the mounds fell victim to zealous grading, planting, or building, the new civilization of land levelers replacing the mound builders of a previous age. Today, the eye searches in vain for elevation on the delta landscapes, and quickly reaches the horizon at almost every point on the compass. As the ground was leveled, the social strata became more steeply separated. Census figures from antebellum Mississippi reveal the sharp racial divide between town and country. Whites outnumbered blacks 2-to-1 in cities such as Vicksburg and Natchez, but the reverse held true in the surrounding countryside, and especially in the Delta region where, by 1850, there were 5 slaves for every white resident. As a result, the slave experience was seldom touched by the varied influences of town life. The white artisans and tradesmen of the city worked hard to retain this state of affairs. Records have preserved the response of one white mechanic who was offered the assistance of several slaves for 6 years, provided he taught them his craft. He angrily responded that he would rather starve than teach the mechanical arts to a black man, and even the few slaves who managed to find places within the city economy failed to mitigate this great divide between town and country. They tended to hold themselves apart from the field slaves and the associations of plantation life. But if city ways were dictated by the white power structure, the sheer impact of numbers ensured that the cultural tone of rural Mississippi would be shaped by black realities. The repression, even the brutality, of daily life could not prevent the black population from dominating the music-making, the storytelling, the values, and priorities of the Delta region. The emergence of the blues depended, one suspects, in no small part on this pervasiveness of the black experience and its relative isolation from the formalities of city life. We have seen this same pattern elsewhere in the New World, in Bahia, in Haiti, and Jamaica, where black populations achieved a critical mass that shaped the culture despite tremendous poverty and a general absence of opportunities for social or individual betterment. It is interesting to note that these same settings have produced some of the most vibrant musical traditions of the last 100 years. If music were a fungible commodity, like gold or oil, perhaps these pauperized economies might form an OPEC of song, demanding monopoly pricing for their sole treasure. But as it stands, these riches have spread freely, crossing borders in ways that no tariff or customs agent can hinder, a duty-free gift to the world. Today, the blues remains the Delta region's most lasting legacy, still potent after so many other dreams here have faded away. Most of our cotton now comes from Asia. China is the leading producer in the world, while India has also surpassed the United States in annual output, and Pakistan may soon do the same. Delta farmers are hard-pressed to survive in this global marketplace, and double-digit unemployment rates are endemic. Although some hope for manufacturing jobs to take up the slack, even these are disappearing in the face of more aggressive competitors overseas. In this harsh environment, the promise of tourism beguiles with its potential for easy dollars from those anxious to experience, in the language of marketing, the land where the blues began. But not everyone shares in this dream. Some of us in Mississippi don't like to be too closely associated with the blues, a music professor at one of the state's universities confided to me. People tend to think that it is all we've got. Yet the blues music, so despised by the masters of the region in earlier years, looms larger and larger in the region's self-identity and economy with each passing decade, until it has come to represent the most promising substitute for the riches no longer given up freely by the soil. We cannot prove that the blues began here, the assertions of tourism brochures notwithstanding, although the Delta's claim as its birthplace is as strong as any other region's. Yet the music thrived here with a special intensity that demands our attention and earns our respect. The blues, by its nature, is a raw, roughshod music with few frills, but especially on this stretch of land. The music here often lacks the surface polish of other regional blues styles, the elaborate finger-picking virtuosity of the Piedmont blues, the rapid-fire single-note lines of the Chicago guitarists, or the engaging banter of the Texas songsters. But in its searing emotional fire, the Delta holds second place to none. If, as some have suggested, there are blues and there are deep blues, a gradation marked by an emotional scale more easily felt than defined, then the homegrown variety in this part of the world leaves little doubt about where it stands in the pecking order. The Delta blues possess the deepest roots of all. Simplicity and starkness are defining qualities of the Delta idiom, especially in the choice of instruments and how they are played. Other cities, Chicago or Memphis or Detroit, might pride themselves on their blues bands, but here in the Delta, a band is a rare luxury. A single instrument, the guitar, mostly stands self-sufficient, cradled by the singer, who treats it with tough love, sometimes slapping it in percussive accompaniment, or playing it with a knife or the neck of a broken bottle or some other objet trouvé unknown to Parkening or Segovia. Every once in a while a piano or a fiddle enters our story, but only at the widest intervals, and as for horns, they are as rare as the legendary walking catfish in this Delta landscape, unless you admit the harmonica or kazoo under this stately rubric. But the guitar, inexpensive, portable, suitable for dances or street corners or isolated music-making, was perfectly adapted to the needs and limitations of the people who made this music. Although the guitar is undisputed king of the Delta, it is a much ill-treated one. Chords are not so much strummed as torn from the instrument. Clusters of notes, drawn from a pentatonic scale or colored with wry dissonances, a willy-nilly school of harmony where one seeks in vain for the voice-leading or textbook resolutions taught in music schools. Harmonic variety is not a virtue here. Sometimes a single chord, with just a few modifications, suffices for an entire song, a throbbing texture of sound, insistent and unrelenting. Often compositions are built around a single riff, a repeated figure, perhaps only a few notes that serve as anchor, compass, and engine room all put together for a blues performance. Melodies are no more ornate than the harmonies, a wail or a growl counting for as much as a coloratura. At times the voice seems to want to blend into the guitar, and the guitar aspires to be a voice, one completing a phrase started by the other. This is strange, wonderful music, no less peculiar for having eventually achieved lasting appeal and commercial success. Especially in its earliest days, the Delta blues tended to defy all the common expectations of popular art forms. Nowhere is this more evident than in the lyrics to these songs. On a superficial level, the Delta music dealt with the familiar themes of love and courtship, travels and adventures. But the psychological aspects of these encounters almost always overwhelmed the incidents related. Indeed, these songs almost never told a complete story, but merely sketched enough detail to communicate a charged and turbulent state of mind. Odder still was the propensity of the Delta blues singers to address these secular topics with a fervor more typical of religious music. Sometimes the songs explicitly talked about fall and redemption, about the devil in hot pursuit, or anticipated some coming apocalypse in language more resonant of the Book of Revelation than the Book of Love. But even when the time-honored topics of romance or wanderlust figure in this music, They are regularly filtered through an anguished soul-searching, rarely broached by any commercial tunesmith. We are blessed to have inherited these songs as a key part of our American, and now our global, cultural legacy. Around the time Robert Johnson recorded his first blues, a Mississippi writer quipped that the Delta region begins in the lobby of the Peabody Hotel in Memphis and ends on Catfish Row in Vicksburg. A music historian today might reverse the order, starting on Catfish Row, then migrating across the lands that gave us Robert Johnson, Son House, Charley Patton, Muddy Waters, Howlin Wolf, and so many others, and ending not at the Peabody, but 8 miles away at Graceland, the spiritual home of the rock music that drew its life force from the Delta blues. Here is the true final destination of the Delta sound, the gateway through which it entered the genetic code of contemporary song, changing how we play, hear, and even move to the music of our modern lives. Critic Nat Hentoff likes to tell how, when he first heard Elvis Presley on the radio, he was certain that the singer was the Delta bluesman Arthur Big Boy Crudup, who refined his distinctive style in Clarksdale in the late 1930s. The first stirrings of rock in those early days merely extended by the shortest of intervals the musical roots that had germinated decades before in the receptive soil of the Delta region. As Muddy Waters would later sing, the blues had a baby, and they named the baby rock and roll. As for the grandchildren, they are literally too many to name. In a very real sense, the rough and insistent Delta sound now pulsates as the underlying heartbeat of virtually all styles of popular music. 2. On Being Blue. Where do we begin in plumbing the depths of the blues? William Gass, in his eccentric philosophical treatise On Being Blue, has attempted to circumscribe this melancholy color and concept, aiming to establish its eminence among the hues, no, not as found in objects of the natural world, where it is relatively rare, but within our psyches. Blue, he argues, conveys an extraordinary emotional range, and, as such, is most suitable as the color of the interior life. Gass focuses primarily on painters and poets, the visual image and the written word, and seems blissfully unaware of flatted thirds and bent fifths. His preferred blue is the blue for blue's sake of Jackson Pollock, or the overcast blue of the air, as described by Wallace Stevens. Yet his comments apply with even greater validity to the blue spectrum of the musical arts. We will never know the sage who christened the distinctive music of the Mississippi Delta, who perhaps also linked it to the low-down melancholy that shares its name. But the choice was inspired. Call it what you will, the Blue Devils, the Blue Funk, or merely the blues. Is it concrete noun or abstract noun? Singular or plural? If ever sound could map the dark night of the soul, the churning waters within, it would be these heartfelt strains. Yet, where should we begin in telling its story? With the great Mississippi flood of 1927 and the first traditional blues recordings of the 1920s? With the first published sheet music in 1912, in the Delta land of the turn of the century, among the plantations and cotton fields of the antebellum South, on the slave ships with their doleful commerce in human misery, or in the rich musical traditions of Mother Africa. Every beginning seems to point back to an earlier reference point, every tradition to a previous one. No consensus view guides us on this matter. Some hear the birth of the blues in the field hollers of the 19th century. Others find its counterpart in the songs of the griots of West Africa, or the bardic practices of East Africa, or the music of the Yoruba priests, or the calls to prayer of the Islamic tradition. We know the finished product. The genealogy eludes us. This constant seeking backward in time, this quest for more and more distant roots of the blues, is also a part of the distinctive culture of the music. Just as blues fans prize the oldest musicians as being closer to the source, more in touch with primal springs from whence blueness came, just so do they also seek antecedents for the art form as a whole, convinced that it must arise from deep in the abyss of time. The very words and phrases associated with the blues convey this pervasive view. In recent years, fans have taken to referring to the blues as roots music, the horticultural analogy suggesting an origin before all other styles, a first sprouting from which all other branches derive. Others call it the devil's music, sometimes as denunciation, just as often as praise, implying an antediluvian origin just beyond the gates of Eden. The history of the music, as documented, may be brief when measured in years, but the emotional truths, the wisdom of the blues, are dimly felt to have required the accumulation of centuries before appearing in recording studios and on acetate discs. In seeking first causes and earliest influences, our study of this music inevitably draws us back to Africa. But this lineage, as we shall see, raises far more questions than answers. Our historical information is scanty but tantalizing. An account of slave ships from 1793 is indicative. In the intervals between their meals, they, the slaves, are encouraged to divert themselves with music and dancing, for which purpose such rude and uncouth instruments as are used in Africa are collected before their departure. No benevolent spirit inspired this indulgence. The high mortality rate on board slave ships motivated traders to encourage exercise and recreation among their captive passengers in hopes of preserving their health and energy. In some instances, flogging was ordered for those who refused to dance. Put simply, mercenary considerations facilitated the export of African music to the New World, and such practices can be documented for a period of over 150 years, from 1693 to 1859. The tolerance of slave traders was not always matched by slave owners once the dismal cargo was landed, and many instances of prohibition or repression of music and dancing, public or private, could be provided. The reasons given were various. Some slave owners feared any occasion for large numbers of slaves to gather together. Others found the dancing sinful and lascivious. Still others may have been driven merely by cruelty or a tyrannical disposition. But whatever the motives, the results were invariably the same. The various steps taken merely hindered and never eliminated or significantly impoverished the musical life of African Americans, which continued to be distinguished by its abundance and vitality. As one might expect, the music of black Americans bore the unmistakable stamp of their African heritage, but tracing the linkages is a far more complicated endeavor than might appear at first glance. First, African music is not a monolithic construct, but itself a composite of many different cultural traditions. Recall that even today there are more than 50 countries in Africa and over 1,000 tribes and spoken languages. Just so, song and dance, instruments and performance styles, related rituals and social practices show extraordinary variety and contrast. Isolating specific attributes as exemplary of African musical traditions from these diverse strands is a complicated task, and our path becomes even more difficult if we try to connect these common threads with the blues, since many of these practices were transformed on the soil of the New World. Some changes were small, others large, but the cumulative impact of the adaptations, in the instruments employed, the ways they were played, in the settings and social milieu, and so on, were substantial and are impossible to ignore. Finally, the blues on its arrival brought with it entirely new aspects, not derivative of either African or American precedents. A revolutionary new sound was born, forever changing the landscape of popular music, setting off reverberations still heard today. Even the most imaginative and resourceful historical sleuthing will fail to reduce it to a summation of pre-existing influences. Just as a study of the rules of cricket, however thorough and painstaking, will never suffice for an understanding of the game of baseball, so the blues resists assimilation into its African prehistory. A generation ago, the pioneering blues writer Samuel Charters confronted this chasm between new and old when he journeyed through Africa to uncover the roots of the blues. Packing microphones and tape recorder, bringing along as well decades of experience studying the American blues, Charters was like an explorer already familiar with the ebb and flow, the magnificent outpouring of a great river,
Sample complete. Ready to continue?